first published as a 20-episode serial between March 1852 and September 1853. The novel has many characters and several subplots, and is told partly by the novel's heroine, Esther Summerson, and partly by an omniscient narrator. At the center of Bleak House is a long-running legal case in the Court of Chancery, Jarndyce and Jarndyce, which comes about because a testator has written several conflicting wills. In a preface to the 1853 first edition, Dickens claimed there were many actual precedents for his fictional case. One such was probably the Thellisson v. Woodford case, in which a will read in 1797 was contested and not determined until 1859. Though many in the legal profession criticized Dickens's satire as exaggerated, this novel helped support a judicial reform movement which culminated in the enactment of legal reform in the 1870s. Jarndyce and Jarndyce is an interminable law case in the Court of Chancery, concerning two or more wills and the beneficiaries of them. Sir Leicester Dedlock and his wife Honoria live on his estate at Chesney Wold. Lady Dedlock is a beneficiary under one of the wills. While listening to the reading by the family solicitor, Mr. Tulkinghorn, of an affidavit, she recognizes the handwriting on the copy. The sight affects her so much she almost faints, which Mr. Tulkinghorn notices and investigates. He traces the copyist, a pauper known only as Nemo, in London. Nemo has recently died, and the only person to identify him is a street sweeper, a poor homeless boy named Joe, who lives in a particularly grim and poverty-stricken part of the city known as Tom All Alone's. Nemo is Latin for nobody. Esther Summerson is raised by the harsh Miss Barbary, who tells her, "Your mother, Esther, is your disgrace, and you were hers." After Miss Barbary dies, John Jarndyce becomes Esther's guardian and assigns the Chancery lawyer, Conversation, Kenji, to take charge of her future. After attending school for 6 years, Esther moves in with him at his home, Bleak House. Jarndyce simultaneously assumes custody of two other wards, Richard Carstone and Ada Clare, who are both his and one another's distant cousins. They are beneficiaries in one of the wills at issue in Jarndyce and Jarndyce. Their guardian is a beneficiary under another will, and the two wills conflict. Richard and Ada soon fall in love, but though Mr. Jarndyce does not oppose the match, he stipulates that Richard must first choose a profession. Richard first tries a career in medicine, and Esther meets Alan Woodcourt, a physician, at the house of Richard's tutor. When Richard mentions the prospect of gaining from the resolution of Jarndyce and Jarndyce, John Jarndyce beseeches him never to put faith in what he calls the family curse. Richard decides to change his career to law. He later switches again and spends the remainder of his funds to buy a commission as a military officer. Lady Dedlock is also investigating the copyist, disguised as her maid, Mademoiselle Hortense. Lady Dedlock pays Joe to take her to Nemo's grave. Meanwhile, Mr. Tulkinghorn is concerned. Lady Dedlock has a secret which could threaten the interests of Sir Leicester, and he watches her constantly, even enlisting her maid to spy on her. He also enlists Inspector Bucket to run Joe out of town, to eliminate anything that might connect Nemo to the Dedlocks. Esther sees Lady Dedlock at church and talks with her later at Chesney Wold. Lady Dedlock discovers that Esther is her own child, unknown to Sir Leicester. Before she married, Honoria had a lover, Captain Hawdon, Nemo, and had a daughter by him who she had believed was dead. The daughter, Esther, was brought up by Honoria's sister, Miss Barbary. Esther becomes sick, possibly with smallpox, since it severely disfigures her, from the homeless boy Joe. Lady Dedlock waits until Esther has recovered before telling her the truth. Though Esther and Lady Dedlock are happy to be reunited, Lady Dedlock tells Esther they must never acknowledge their connection again. Upon her recovery, Esther finds that Richard, having failed at several professions, has ignored his guardian's advice and is trying to push Jarndyce and Jarndyce to conclusion in his Anita's favor, and has fallen out with John Jarndyce. In the process, Richard loses all his money and declines in health. He and Ada have secretly married, and Ada is pregnant. Esther has her own romance when Mr. Woodcourt returns to England, having survived a shipwreck, and he continues to seek her company despite her disfigurement. However, Esther has already agreed to marry her guardian, the much older John Jarndyce. Mademoiselle Hortense and Mr. Tulkinghorn discover the truth about Lady Dedlock's past. After a confrontation with Mr. Tulkinghorn, Lady Dedlock flees her home, leaving a note apologizing to Sir Leicester for her conduct. Mr. Tulkinghorn dismisses Hortense, who is no longer of any use to him. Mr. Tulkinghorn is shot through the heart, and suspicion falls on Lady Dedlock. Sir Leicester, discovering his lawyer's death and his wife's confession and flight, suffers a catastrophic stroke, but he manages to communicate that he forgives his wife and wants her to return. Inspector Bucket, who has previously investigated several matters related to Jarndyce and Jarndyce, accepts Sir Leicester's commission to find Lady Dedlock. At first he suspects Lady Dedlock of the murder but is able to clear her of suspicion after discovering Hortense's guilt. He requests Esther's help to find her mother. Lady Dedlock has no way to know of her husband's forgiveness or that she has been cleared of suspicion, and she wanders the country in cold weather before dying at the cemetery of her former lover, Captain Hawdon, Nemo. Esther and Inspector Bucket find her there. Progress in Jarndyce and Jarndyce seems to take a turn for the better when a later will is found, which revokes all previous wills and leaves the bulk of the estate to Richard and Ada. John Jarndyce cancels his engagement to Esther, who becomes engaged to Mr. Woodcourt. They go to Chancery to find Richard. On their arrival, they learn that the case of Jarndyce and Jarndyce is finally over, because the costs of litigation have entirely consumed the estate. Richard collapses, and M.R. Woodcourt diagnoses him as being in the last stages of tuberculosis. Richard apologizes to John Jarndyce and dies. John Jarndyce takes in Ada and her child, a boy whom she names Richard. Esther and Mr. Woodcourt marry and live in a Yorkshire house which Jarndyce gives to them. The couple later raise 2 daughters. Many of the novel's subplots focus on minor characters. One such subplot is the hard life and happy, though difficult, marriage of Caddy Jellyby and Prince Turveydrop. Another plot focuses on George Rouncewell's rediscovery of his family, and his reunion with his mother and brother. Major characters. Esther Summerson is the heroine. She is Dickens's only female narrator. Esther is raised as an orphan by her godmother Miss Barbary, who is in fact her aunt. She does not know her parents' identity. Miss Barbary holds macabre vigils on Esther's birthday each year, telling her that her birth is no cause for celebration, because the girl is her mother's disgrace, despite, or perhaps because of, her cruel upbringing. She is self-effacing, self-deprecating and grateful for every trifle. The discovery of her true identity provides much of the drama in the book. Finally it is revealed that she is the illegitimate daughter of Lady Dedlock and Nemo, later learned to be Captain Hawdon. Honoria, Lady Dedlock is the haughty and beautiful mistress of Chesney Wold. The revelation of her past drives much of the plot. Before her marriage, Lady Dedlock had an affair with another man and bore his child. Her sister had told her at the time of the birth that the infant was stillborn. Years later, however, Lady Dedlock discovers that the child was born alive and that her identity is Esther Summerson. Because Lady Dedlock has revealed that she harbors a secret predating her marriage, she has attracted the curiosity of Mr. Tulkinghorn, who feels bound by his ties to his client, Sir Leicester, to pry out this secret. At the end of the novel, Lady Dedlock dies, disgraced in her own mind and convinced that her husband could never forgive what she imagines to be her own moral failings. John Jarndyce is an unwilling party in Jarndyce and Jarndyce, guardian of Richard, Ada, and Esther, and owner of Bleak House. Vladimir Nabokov called him one of the best and kindest human beings ever described in a novel. 8. A wealthy man, he helps most of the other. Characters, motivated by a combination of goodness and guilt at the mischief and human misery caused by Jarndyce and Jarndyce, which he calls the family curse. At first, it seems possible that he is Esther's father, but he makes clear he is her guardian shortly after she comes to live under his roof, explaining the letter he received asking him to take on that role a few years earlier. He falls in love with Esther and wishes to marry her, but gives her up because she is in love with Mr. Woodcourt. Richard Carstone is a ward of Chancery in Jarndyce and Jarndyce. Straightforward and likable but irresponsible and inconstant, Richard falls under the spell of Jarndyce and Jarndyce. At the end of the book, just after Jarndyce and Jarndyce is finally settled, he dies, worn out by his imprudence in trusting to the outcome of a Chancery suit. Ada Clare is another young ward of Chancery in Jarndyce and Jarndyce. She falls in love with Richard Carstone, a distant cousin. They later marry in secret and she has Richard's child. She is the dear friend of Esther. Harold Skimpole is a friend of Jarndyce, in the habit of sponging his friends, Nuttall. He is irresponsible, selfish, amoral, and without remorse. He often refers to himself as a child, and claims not to understand human relationships, circumstances, and society, but actually understands them very well, as he demonstrates when he enlists Richard and Esther to pay off the bailiff who has arrested him on a writ of debt. He believes that Richard and Ada will be able to acquire credit based on their expectations in Jarndyce and Jarndyce and declares his intention to start honoring them by letting them pay some of his debts. This character is commonly regarded as a portrait of Leigh Hunt. Dickens wrote in a letter of the 25th of September 1853, "I suppose he is the most exact portrait that was ever painted in words. ... It is an absolute reproduction of a real man." A contemporary critic commented, "I recognized Skimpole instantaneously, and so did every person whom I talked with about it who had ever had Leigh Hunt's acquaintance." 9. G. K. Chesterton suggested that Dickens may never once have had the unfriendly thought, suppose Hunt behaved like a rascal. He may have only had the fanciful thought, suppose a rascal behaved like Hunt. Lawrence Boythorn is an old friend of John Jarndyce's, a former soldier who speaks in superlatives, very loud and harsh, but good-hearted. Boythorn was once engaged to and very much in love with a woman who later left him without giving him any reason. That woman was Miss Barbary, who abandoned her former life and Boythorn when she took Esther from her sister. Boythorn is also a neighbor of Sir Leicester Dedlock's, with whom he is engaged in an epic tangle of lawsuits over a right-of-way across Boythorn's property that Sir Leicester asserts the legal right to close. He is thought to be based on the writer Walter Savage Landor. Sir Leicester Dedlock is a crusty baronet, much older than his wife. Dedlock is an unthinking conservative who regards the Jarndyce and Jarndyce lawsuit as a mark of distinction worthy of a man of his family lineage. On the other hand, he is shown as a loving and devoted husband towards Lady Dedlock, even after he learns about her secret. Mr. Bill Tulkinghorn is Sir Leicester's lawyer. He defers to his clients but enjoys and is driven by the power his control of their secrets gives him. He learns of Lady Dedlock's past and tries to control her conduct, in the name of preserving the reputation and good name of Sir Leicester. He is murdered, and his murder gives Dickens the chance to weave a detective plot into the closing chapters of the book. Mr. Wallace Snagsby is the timid and henpecked proprietor of a law stationery business who gave law writer work to Nemo. Snagsby gets involved with Mr. Tulkinghorn and Inspector Bucket's secrets. He is Joe's only friend. He tends to give half-crowns to those for whom he feels sorry. Miss Annie Flite is an elderly eccentric. Her family has been destroyed by a long-running chancery case similar to Jarndyce and Jarndyce, and her obsessive fascination with chancery veers between comedy and tragedy. She owns a large number of little birds which she says will be released on the Day of Judgment. Mr. William Guppy is a law clerk at Kenji and Carboy. He becomes smitten with Esther and makes an offer of marriage, which she refuses. Later, after Esther learns that Lady Dedlock is her mother, she asks to meet Mr. Guppy to tell him to stop investigating her past. He fears the meeting is to accept his offer of marriage, which he does not want to pursue now that she is disfigured. He is relieved when she explains her true purpose and he agrees to do everything in his power to protect her privacy in the future. After he gains full status as an attorney, ready to start his own practice, Chapter 59, he again proposes to Esther, in the presence of Mr. Jarndyce, Woterns Guppy down, without telling him she was engaged to Woodcourt. Inspector Bucket of the Detective Branch is a Metropolitan Police detective who undertakes several investigations throughout the novel, most notably the investigation of the murder of Mr. Tulkinghorn. He is notable in being one of the first detectives in English fiction. 12. This character is probably based on Inspector Charles Frederick Field of the then recently formed Detective Branch at Scotland Yard. Dickens wrote several journalistic pieces about the inspector and the work of the detectives in Household Words. It has also been argued that the character was based on Jack Witcher, one of the original 8 detectives set up by Scotland Yard in the middle 19th century. Mr. George is a former soldier, who once served under Nemo, who owns a London shooting gallery and is a trainer in sword and pistol. The first suspect in the murder of Mr. Tulkinghorn, he is exonerated and his true identity is revealed, against his wishes, to his mother. He is George Rouncewell, son of the Dedlock's housekeeper, Mrs. Rouncewell, who welcomes him back to Chesney Wold. He ends the book as body servant to the stricken Sir Leicester Dedlock. Caddy Caroline Jellyby is a friend of Esther's, secretary to her mother. Caddy feels ashamed of her own lack of manners, but Esther's friendship hardens her. Caddy falls in love with Prince Turveydrop, marries him, and has a baby. Crook is a rag and bottle merchant and collector of papers. He is the landlord of the house where Nemo and Miss Flite live and where Nemo dies. He seems to subsist on a diet of gin. Crook dies from a case of spontaneous combustion, something that Dickens believed could happen, but which some critics, such as the English essayist George Henry Lewis, denounced as outlandish. Amongst the stacks of papers obsessively hoarded by the illiterate Crook is the key to resolving the case of Jarndyce and Jarndyce. Joe is a young boy who lives on the streets and tries to make a living as a crossing sweeper. Joe was the only person with whom Nemo had any real connection. Nemo expressed a paternal sort of interest in Joe, something that no other human had ever done. Nemo would share his meager money with Joe, and would sometimes remark, "Well, Joe, today I am as poor as you," when he had nothing to share. Joe is called to testify at the inquiry into Nemo's death, but knows nothing of value. Despite this, Mr. Tulkinghorn pays Inspector Bucket to harry Joe and force him to leave town, because Mr. Tulkinghorn fears Joe might have some knowledge of the connection between Nemo and the Deadlocks. Joe ultimately dies from a disease pneumonia, a complication from an earlier bout with smallpox which Esther also catches and from which she almost dies. Alan Woodcourt is a surgeon and a kind, caring man who loves Esther deeply. She in turn loves him but feels unable to respond, not only because of her prior commitment to John Jarndyce, but also because she fears her illegitimacy will cause his mother to object to their connection. Grandfather Joshua Smallweed is a moneylender, a mean, bad-tempered man who shows no mercy to people who owe him money and who enjoys inflicting emotional pain on others. He lays claim to the deceased Crook's possessions because Smallweed's wife is Crook's sister and only living relation. Smallweed also drives Mr. George into bankruptcy by abruptly calling in a loan. It has been suggested that his description, together with his grandchildren, fits that of a person with progeria, although people with progeria only have a life expectancy of 14 years, while Grandfather Smallweed is very old. Mr. E.D.V. Holes is a chancery lawyer who takes on Richard Carstone as a client, squeezes out of him all the litigation fees he can manage to pay, and then abandons him when Jarndyce comes to an end. Conversation. Kenji is a chancery lawyer who represents John Jarndyce, and has apprentice attorneys in his office, including Mr. Guppy and more briefly, Richard Carstone. His chief foible is his love of grand, pretentious, and empty rhetoric. Minor characters. Mr. Gridley is an involuntary party to a suit in Chancery based on a real case, according to Dickens's preface, who repeatedly seeks in vain to gain the attention of the Lord Chancellor. He threatens Mr. Tulkinghorn and then is put under arrest by Inspector Bucket, but dies, his health broken by his Chancery ordeal. The character is based on the true case of Thomas Cook of Onecote, Bleak, which was brought to Dickens' attention in 1849 by his solicitor Mr. W. Challenor of Leek. Nemo, Latin for nobody, is the alias of Captain James Hawdon, a former officer in the British Army under whom Mergeorgence served. Nemo is a law writer who makes fair copies of legal documents for Snagsby and lodges at Crook's Rag and Bottle Shop, eventually dying of an opium overdose. He is later found to be Lady Dedlock's former lover, and the father of Esther Summerson. Mrs. Snagsby is Mr. Snagsby's highly suspicious and curious wife, who has a vinegary personality and incorrectly suspects Mr. Snagsby of keeping many secrets from her. She suspects he is Joe's father. Guster is the Snagsby's maidservant, prone to fits. Neckett is a debt collector called Coavinses by debtor Harold Skimpole because he works for that business firm. Charlie is Neckett's daughter, hired by John Jarndyce to be a maid to Esther. Called Little Coavinses by Skimpole. Thomas Neckett's young son. Emma Neckett's baby daughter. Mrs. Jellyby is Caddy's mother, a telescopic philanthropist, obsessed with an obscure African tribe but having little regard for the notion of charity beginning at home. It's thought Dickens wrote this character as a criticism of female activists like Caroline Chisholm. Mr. Jellyby is Mrs. Jellyby's long-suffering husband. P.P. Jellyby is the Jellyby's young son. Prince Turveydrop is a dancing master and proprietor of a dance studio. Old Mr. Turveydrop is a master of deportment who lives off his son's industry. Jenny is a brickmaker's wife. She is mistreated by her husband and her baby dies. She then helps her friend look after her own child. Rosa is a favorite lady's maid of Lady Dedlock whom Wat Rouncewell wishes to marry. The proposal is initially refused when Mr. Rouncewell's father asks that Rosa be sent to school to become a lady worthy of his son's station. Lady Dedlock questions the girl closely regarding her wish to leave, and promises to look after her instead. In some way, Rosa is a stand-in for Esther in Lady Dedlock's life. Hortense is lady's maid to Lady Dedlock. Her character is based on the Swiss maid and murderer Maria Manning. Mrs. Rouncewell is housekeeper to the Dedlocks at Chesney Wold. Mr. Robert Rouncewell, the adult son of Mrs. Rouncewell, is a prosperous ironmaster. Wat Rouncewell is Robert Rouncewell's son. Volumnia is a cousin of the Dedlocks, given to screaming. Miss Barbary is Esther's godmother and severe childhood guardian, and sister of Lady Dedlock. Mrs. Rachel Chadband is a former servant of Miss Barbary's. Mr. Chadband is an oleaginous preacher, husband of Mrs. Chadband. Mrs. Smallweed is the wife of Mr. Smallweed Sr. and sister to Crook. She is suffering from dementia. Young Mr. or Bart Bartholomew Smallweed is the grandson of the senior Smallweeds, twin of Judy Smallweed, and friend of Mr. Guppy. Judy Judith Smallweed is the granddaughter of the senior Smallweeds, and twin of Bartholomew Smallweed. Tony Jobling, who adopts the alias Mr. Weevil, is a friend of William Guppy. Mrs. Guppy is Mr. Guppy's aged mother. Phil Squad is Mr. George's assistant. Matthew Bagnet is a military friend of Mr. George's and a dealer in musical instruments. Mrs. Bagnet is the wife of Matthew Bagnet. Woolwich is the Bagnet's son. Quebec is the Bagnet's elder daughter. Malta is the Bagnet's younger daughter. Mrs. Woodcourt is Alan Woodcourt's widowed mother. Mrs. Pardiggle is a woman who does good works for the poor, but cannot see that her efforts are rude and arrogant, and do nothing at all to help. She inflicts her activities on her 5 small sons, who are clearly rebellious. Arethusa Skimpole is Mr. Skimpole's beauty daughter. Laura Skimpole is Mr. Skimpole's sentiment daughter. Kitty Skimpole is Mr. Skimpole's comedy daughter. Mrs. Skimpole is Mr. Skimpole's ailing wife, who is weary of her husband and his way of life.